Hi and welcome to part two of the Global Challenges and Opportunities series. Today I'll be talking about the rising greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very interesting topic as this is something that encompasses all of us around the globe. This is something that even at COP21, the Climate Change Paris Agreement, the issue was raised, and essentially it has to do with increasing amounts of pollution, so air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, and the extreme weather pattern changes that we're experiencing, from hurricanes to tornadoes to earthquakes, etc. And fundamentally, all this can be traced back to the late 19th century and early 20th century. During that time, we had a massive boom in industrial activity. At that time, you had Vanderbilt, and this was happening in the US. So prior to the World Wars, a lot of movement was happening in the US. And over there, you had people like Vanderbilt with the railways. You had Rockefeller with the oil. You had Carnegie with the steel. You had J.P. Morgan with his banking system. You had Edison with the light bulb and DC current. You had Tesla with the AC current. You had Westinghouse as an investor to back Tesla for his AC current, which then they competed. There was AC/DC wars at Niagara Falls. And lastly, you had Henry Ford. And during this period of time, you saw an exponential boom in industrial activity, to the extent that we now take much of it for granted. I mean, the concept of even light bulbs, we think that there's something ancient, they've been around for a very long time, but the reality is far from the truth, because it wasn't until um, early 19th century or mid 19th century, sorry, 20th century, mid 20th century or early 20th century, where these things came about. To the point where JP Morgan was really interested in impressing his father, and so they organized a banquet with all the wealthy entrepreneurs at the time, and Rockefeller was there, Carnegie was there, and they wanted to JP Morgan wanted to impress his father, so he got Edison to get the house lit up with all these light bulbs. And when he asked his father what he thought of the light bulb invention, his father's reply was, "I think these belong in the circus," i.e., he wasn't too impressed. But as history goes to tell us that to show us that we see light bulbs everywhere. You know, we see them in cars, we see them in homes, and the bottom line is that whatever is financially backed, where there's a will, there's a way. You can make things happen. And J.P. Morgan proved that. He proved that point. When it came to Tesla, on the other hand, where Tesla had figured out how to give free energy to humanity, and he went to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan's question was, "What's in it for me?" And that led to Tesla's tower on Winchcliffe Island. If I'm not mistaken, that's the island it was built on. The Tesla Tower that was burnt down, and essentially this movement towards rising greenhouse gas emissions can be traced back around that period. So around that period from 1880, as you can see on this diagram, to the mid 20th century, so late 19th century to mid 20th century. And post World Wars, you had an exponential boom in greenhouse gas emissions. And so I will I would like to just introduce a story that that got me really interested in this area, because I didn't have the awareness about emissions and the impact until I'd met this fellow. this amazing personality, Professor Mike Bauman, who worked for BP 30 years, who was one of the lead researchers. He worked in Texas, and we happened to meet at this energy summer school organized by the University of Manchester. And over there, he departed with me some tremendous insights and something that stuck with me, well, for the rest of my life. So he gave a presentation, and he has a background of a geologist, but he gave his presentation and by starting off by saying that he wanted to apologize on the behalf of his generation, the scientists and engineers of his generation, to my generation, because he said that we've let you down. And what he actually meant was that in the last century, the engineering activities and the research activities have been geared towards essentially maximizing emissions and profits, in essence. And there was no real consideration for sustainability and the actual impact it was having on the overall global climate, and the impact it would have on the future generations. Because what we have to realize is that basically after the world wars, it was a golden period. It was a period after fear, after having so much fear that your life's at risk, to have this period of peace. It leads to flourishing societies, and what you have is essentially a golden period whereby people would like to indulge extravagantly into material things, and this was much more consequential rather than intentional, in my opinion. Um, and so, in that pursuit of this economic boom, with the invention of colored TVs coming on the scene, these cars and becoming readily available and being uptaken by virtually as many people as possible, um, freely accessible, and what you had was this carelessness, this lack of foresightedness of what the consequences of the actions would be at that time, until we find ourselves in this predicament of this climate change and global warming, where we've got these extreme patterns in weather patterns. And so what he ended up saying was, he concluded his presentation by saying was um, that he wanted our generation of PhDs. So the seminar was for PhDs on the energy sector, and he said that he wanted us to reflect on whether our generation would be ready or would be prepared to downgrade civilization for the sake of the future generation. I.e., would we be happy to live a lifestyle without phones? Would we be happy to live a lifestyle without TVs and all this? Downgrade our civilization for today, so that the future generations can live a better quality lifestyle. And so he ended it on a very not so optimistic note, which left someone like me pondering. And I then went and asked a lot of my peers, and I asked a lot of my friends on what they made of these conclusions. And the bottom line was, no one was willing to downgrade civilization. No one is willing to let go of their phones and technologies for the sake of the future generations. That's a given. And so that's what resulted me to think of a solution that could not compromise on that, but to curtail that. And that's what got me involved into the bioeconomy movement. Okay, so if we can't eliminate and eradicate the thing completely, we can at least curtail it. And the key thing Professor Mike Bauman also shared was that, as you can see from this diagram, the total emissions, the black line, majority of the emissions initially have been due to coal. So coal is the blue line, which represents solid carbon, things that create a carbon footprint. And then the liquid is essentially oil, and the gas is natural gas. And as you can see, it's coal that contributes to most of the emissions. And so one of the solutions is that we can transition from coal to oil to gas. So the more gas we use, the emissions, we can bring down emissions through that route. But the other thing was that the industry itself was not alone to blame. The academics also didn't do their jobs, because although industry largely dictates academia in this day and age, despite what people may say, academics should have taken a stand, which they didn't. They just accepted things and, like sheep, just took whichever direction was being taken. Um, and as far as engineering is concerned, engineers created the problem, and so in my opinion they should solve it. And just like with many illnesses, the root cause of an illness is often very closely linked to the cure of that illness also. So if we go back to the root cause of this, it's essentially research and enterprise, so entrepreneurship, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so, in my opinion, we need to look to replicate that model, but do it in a much more philosophical manner and much more reflective manner, um, learning from the past mistakes of the previous predecessors of research and science of the last centuries. And not only that, learning from much more of a historical perspective, like you've had other golden ages throughout history, and see how they did things. And so this is essentially where the greenhouse gas emission problem stems from. And this is as you can see, after 9/11, there's been an exponential increase in emissions, and that is still ever rising. Especially after 9/11, you had China increasing its industrial activity. So, as it's illustrated in this diagram, so the G8 contribute to approximately 50% of the emissions, and then next it's the G20 nations, which contribute to roughly 30% of the emissions. Of them, you have China and India. And here's the thing, we're in a very dangerous battle, because China essentially says to the US that you cause global warming, which, if I go back, is essentially true. US, the activity of the United States in the last century is what's contributed largely to the global warming. Okay, so China's argument is that you cause global warming, and so it's your job to fix it. Why should we fix it? And so in turn, they are increasing their activity and building their infrastructure. But in this battle for creating and improving their own infrastructures, they are causing a lot of damage to other nations. So non-OPEC nations and even OPEC nations to a lesser extent. But the point is, the ones that will suffer the most are countries, especially in Africa, because this is complete, utter oppression. The reason being is, as someone mentioned at the energy summer school, is that the US and China will have built these infrastructures to withstand the impacts of global warming, be it hurricanes and tornadoes, etc., and they'll be able to stand back up on their feet. Whereas Africa, firstly, they never contributed to it, but then they will suffer in the by the means of droughts, and they will not have the infrastructure in place to combat it. And so this is 21st century oppression like never seen before. And so we are in these very delicate times, and things need to be managed very carefully because we're going down the routes of mass oppression, and if we do not resort to new innovative solutions, such as looking into bioeconomy and looking into water economy and looking into other economies other than oil and gas economies and other than coal-based economies and even natural gas economies, we could have ourselves having contributed to the death of many innocent people and the loss of many innocent lives, much more so than even wars. And so the question is, I will just summarize again using the balance equation. As far as I know, there's no emissions coming out of the Earth's atmosphere into the Earth's atmosphere. There's no emissions leaving out from the Earth into outer space. And so what we have is a simple case of emissions being generated and emissions being consumed. Emissions are largely being consumed by plantations. Okay, so again, deforestation isn't helping. Um, and the generation, we know what is largely down to. And the other thing with the generation and this battle for energy is that another example that was given was the issue of coal. Okay, so the United States used coal initially to develop its infrastructure. Once it was done using coal and developing some renewable infrastructure and some renewable sources, it passed that coal on to China. China then used coal to develop itself, and then when China was done, then it was passed on to Germany. Then when Germany is done, then it gets passed on to Africa. But the point is that the emissions, the footprints of those emissions aren't leaving the planet, it's just being passed down the chain. The other issue is that it's much more of a power struggle also, because we calculated that even if everyone was to switch to thorium reactors, for instance, so these are safe or safer options for nuclear power reactors, that that we could not bring the emissions down quick enough um, to meet the targets that have been set by I think it was 2020. Um, but the other thing is, who funds the thorium reactors? Where does the funding come from? So if Africa wants these thorium reactors, who's going to fund it? And if you fund Africa with thorium reactors, then you're giving them energy. If you're giving Africa energy or other countries energies, then they become direct competitors. And then it's a question of competition and whether these countries are willing to work together or whether they want this pyramid scheme which seems to be in place. This imperialistic ambitions of the US which seem to be there. And perhaps China to a certain extent. And so the root problems seem to be much more deep rooted. But going back to what science can contribute and what we can do as researchers, engineers, economists, and people in academia, or even if you're not in these schemes as a person, as a humanitarian, one thing we can do is, as I mentioned, transition from coal to oil to gas, gradually. So this is for the Middle East. It would be in the best of interest for them and for humanity to begin to start doing this. This would reduce the generation, how much emissions are being generated. To increase renewable usage. Again, by increasing renewable, you won't be generating as much emissions. Increase awareness to conserve energy. And so here's the thing: although the most of the talk that we hear about in industry and academia is about how can we generate more energy. why is it a question of generating more energy? Why isn't it about energy efficiency of transmission of energy, or storage of energy, or not only that, using less energy? Behavioral activities, not leaving the lights on or the fans on or the air conditioning on in warm or hot countries. Um, Again, that is just as important. Developing energy efficient appliances, again, that's a huge area. Why do we not look at reducing consumption? Because reducing consumption is just as important as increasing generation of energy. Um, Improve energy storage, again, something that I've just mentioned. And lastly, develop decentralized economies away from the petro economy. So again, I mentioned this earlier on: a bioeconomy, a renewable electric economy, a hydrogen economy, a methanol economy. These are all alternative economies that you can create. There's not so much awareness about this, but myself for one, I've focused my attention on the bioeconomy, but there's plenty of literature out there that can tell you more about a hydrogen economy, even a water economy, a methanol economy, a renewable electric economy, something that Elon Musk is working on with his Tesla cars and solar PVs, that his Solar City project that he's got. And so, this in a nutshell should give you an idea of what I'm trying to solve with my ventures, the bioeconomy consultancy, and it should also give you a fairly better idea of the importance and significance of what people like myself and Elon Musk are looking to achieve. And the next session will go into much more of the economic side of things, and I hope you've enjoyed this part, and I look forward